At its peak, the British Empire didn't just rule territory, it literally ruled the whole planet Earth, stretching across 35.5 million square kilometers, nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, even larger than the entire Mongol Empire at its peak. Under its crown, over 400 million people lived completely subjugated. The sun literally never set on it. Its navy dominated the oceans, controlling close to 40% of global trade. If any nation defied it, it could be economically strangled, just like how US today sanctions countries owing to its dollar hegemony. But it wasn't always this way. This unstoppable empire began as a poor, battered island on the edge of Europe. It had been conquered and ruled for 400 years by the Roman Empire. It was weaker and poorer than its continental rivals for most of its existence. Still, after all this, nobody was able to stop it from becoming, in true means, the world's first true global superpower that had its reach to every corner of the world. However, the real question is, how did this small, rainy island transform into the world's first true superpower? How did it subjugate the Indian subcontinent, then one of the richest regions on Earth, and extend its grip across every inhabited continent? Today, we'll learn it concisely.
The story of all, the inspiring tale of a little nation that has encompassed the world. It begins in a tiny island off the west of Europe, under whose flag live today a quarter of the world's inhabitants. One of the smallest countries on the map is responsible for the mightiest commonwealth of nations in history.
Imagine a small island of green hills, foggy mornings, and rough coastlines. It doesn't look like the center of world power, and yet, for a time, this island ruled nearly a quarter of the planet. To understand how that happened, we have to go back thousands of years, long before there was a country called Britain. Chapter number 1: Before Britain. The first humans arrived in Britain nearly 800,000 years ago. These early people hunted large animals and survived brutal ice ages. Surprisingly, for long periods, Britain wasn't even an island. It was connected to Europe by a land bridge known as Doggerland until about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Around 13,000 BCE, as the last ice age ended, hunter-gatherers crossed into the region, settling permanently. Over time, small communities formed, living off the land, fishing, hunting, and adapting to a changing climate. There was no Britain yet, just scattered groups trying to survive. Around 4000 BCE, farming changed everything. New settlers brought crops, animals, and permanent villages. Forests were cleared and large monuments were built. One of the most famous is Stonehenge, a massive stone circle that still stands today. These early societies were becoming organized. They had leaders, religious rituals, and trade networks. Over time, during the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, metal tools and weapons improved farming and warfare. Celtic-speaking tribes dominated the land, living in hill forts and following Druidic religious traditions. The Greeks referred to these tribes as Pretani, and later the Romans called them Britanni, which is where the word Britain comes from. Chapter 2. The Romans first tried to invade under Julius Caesar in 55 BCE, but full conquest came later in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius. Roman rule transformed the region. They built roads, cities, bathhouses, and introduced new systems of law and governance. London began as Londinium under Roman control. Massive structures like Hadrian's Wall were built to defend against northern tribes. There were rebellions, like the famous uprising led by Boudica, but still Rome maintained control for nearly 400 years. When the Roman Empire weakened, they withdrew around 410 CE, leaving behind infrastructure and cultural influence that would shape the future. After the Romans left, Britain fragmented. Germanic tribes, the Angles and Saxons, migrated and settled. Angle land eventually became England. Small kingdoms formed, often fighting each other. Later, Viking raids began, bringing violence and new cultural influences. A key figure during this time was Alfred the Great, who defended his kingdom and helped lay the foundation for a more unified England. Over centuries, these different groups blended together, shaping the early English identity. A major turning point came in 1066, when William the Conqueror invaded from Normandy and defeated the English king at the Battle of Hastings. This Norman conquest changed England deeply. French became the language of the ruling class. Castles were built across the country. The feudal system strengthened royal authority. England became more centralized and organized, setting the stage for a stronger state. Over the next few centuries, England was shaped not by steady progress, but by crisis after crisis: wars, plague, rebellion, and religious upheaval. In 1215, rebellious barons forced King John to seal the Magna Carta, a document that for the first time placed limits on royal authority and planted early seeds of constitutional government. It did not create democracy overnight, but it began a long struggle between crown and law that would define England's political evolution. In the mid-1300s, catastrophe struck with the Black Death, which wiped out nearly half of England's population. Entire villages disappeared. Labor became scarce. The rigid feudal system began to crack as surviving workers demanded higher wages and greater mobility. Society was shaken to its core, and the balance of power between nobles and commoners slowly began to shift. The 15th century brought further instability through the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. Decades of bloodshed weakened the old nobility and ultimately paved the way for the rise of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VIII, a new ruling house determined to centralize power and restore order. His son, Henry VIII, transformed England in ways no battlefield could. By breaking from the authority of the Pope and establishing the Church of England, he not only reshaped religion, but also strengthened royal control over the state and its wealth. England was no longer spiritually tied to Rome. It would chart its own path. That path reached a defining moment under his daughter, Elizabeth I. In 1588, her navy defeated the mighty Spanish Armada, the fleet of the most powerful empire in Europe. The victory did more than repel an invasion. It shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and announced that England could compete on the world's oceans. This moment is crucial, because from this point forward, the sea would become England's shield, its highway, and eventually the foundation of an empire. Naval strength was not just military power, it was the gateway to trade, exploration, and global influence. And on the ocean, England would begin its transformation into Britain, and Britain into an empire. Chapter 3: The Start of British Expansion. After defeating the Spanish Armada and gaining confidence in its naval ability, the Brits instigated their colonial ambitions. In 1607, 3 small ships carrying just over 100 settlers founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The early years were brutal. Famine, disease, and conflict nearly wiped the colony out, but tobacco saved it. Soon, more settlements followed. Plymouth Colony in 1620, founded by religious dissenters seeking freedom. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, Maryland, the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia. Along the Atlantic coast, a chain of 13 colonies took shape, stretching from cold New England forests to the humid plantations of the South. At the same time, England expanded into the Caribbean. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica became immensely profitable sugar colonies built on enslaved African labor. Sugar, tobacco, and the transatlantic slave trade tied Britain's economy to a vast and brutal Atlantic system of commerce. The sea was no longer just a defensive barrier, it was an economic engine. But while settlers carved farms out of American forests, something far more consequential was unfolding in Asia. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company. At first, it was simply a commercial venture, a group of merchants seeking spices, textiles, and luxury goods from the East. The company established trading posts in places like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta, operating under the shadow of the powerful Mughal Empire, which at the time was far wealthier and more sophisticated than anything in Europe. For decades, the company was just one trader among many. But in the 18th century, the balance shifted. The Mughal Empire began to fragment under internal strain. European rivalries spilled into India, especially between Britain and France. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where company forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal. It was not a massive battle by European standards, but its consequences were enormous. Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, fell under company control. Revenue from Indian taxation began flowing not just to London merchants, but into financing Britain's growing global power. By the mid-1700s, what had started as a trading corporation was effectively ruling vast territories and millions of people. Meanwhile, in Europe, political transformation strengthened the state behind this expansion. In 1707, the Acts of Union formally united England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, combining resources, fleets, and ambitions. Scottish merchants, soldiers, and administrators would play a major role in imperial expansion. In North America, Britain defeated France in the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, gaining Canada and becoming the dominant European power on the continent. By the 1770s, Britain controlled territory from the Caribbean to Canada, from West African trading posts to Indian provinces. But empire was not stable. In 1776, the American colonies declared independence. After years of war, Britain formally recognized the loss in 1783. The 13 colonies were gone. Yet, this was not the end of expansion. It was a pivot. Deprived of its American mainland colonies, Britain shifted its strategic focus eastward. India became even more central. The company tightened its grip, expanding influence across the subcontinent through warfare, alliances, and revenue control. At the same time, Britain began establishing penal colonies in Australia in 1788, opening another vast territory to settlement. By the eve of the Industrial Revolution, Britain was no longer just a European kingdom with scattered outposts. It was a maritime commercial empire spanning the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, powered by trade, finance, naval dominance, and increasingly by control over Indian wealth. What began in 1600 as a merchant venture seeking spices had, within less than 2 centuries, evolved into the foundation of what would become the largest empire in human history. And crucially, this transformation happened just before industrial machinery and steam power would multiply Britain's strength beyond anything the early colonists of Jamestown could have imagined. Chapter 4: Industrial Revolution, British India, and Absolute Dominance. The Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s didn't just change Britain, it transformed the rules of power. Britain industrialized before anyone else. Steam engines thundering to life, factories belching smoke, and railways slicing across the countryside gave it a speed and scale of production the world had never seen. Iron warships and cannons projected power across oceans, while mass-produced muskets and artillery reshaped armies. Suddenly, Britain could outproduce, outtrade, and outfight its rivals. The conquest of the whole Indian subcontinent marked the turning point of the empire, because India was not just a land of wealth. It held roughly a quarter of the world's GDP, teeming with resources, manpower, and markets. British control of India fed its industrial machine. Cotton from the fields fueled textile mills. Ports like Bombay and Calcutta became hubs of global trade, and Indian revenues financed wars and further expansion. Railways, telegraphs, and factories spread like veins of empire, making India both a jewel of wealth and a backbone of military power. However, Britain's rise was not uncontested. Its expansion triggered a century of wars and rivalries. Battles raged against the French in Europe and India, the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, and the Russians in Central Asia. Naval clashes against Spain, France, and the Netherlands tested its dominance on the seas. Yet, Britain emerged victorious time and again, its industrial might giving it an edge in supply, strategy, and firepower. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the British Empire stretched across continents, ruling a quarter of the world's land and population. From the deserts of Africa to the jungles of India, from the cities of Canada to the ports of Australia, it was said that the sun never sets on the empire, because somewhere the sun was always shining on British power, industry, and influence. Chapter 5: World Wars and Empire Collapse. World War I marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Millions of soldiers from across the globe, India, Canada, Australia, Africa, marched into the trenches for Britain. Though the empire emerged victorious, the cost was staggering. The economy was drained, infrastructure worn thin, and a generation of men lost. Across its colonies, nationalist movements surged, demanding self-rule. Ireland broke away in 1922, claiming independence after decades of struggle, signaling that the empire was no longer untouchable. Then came World War II. Under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Britain stood against Nazi Germany, surviving the Blitz, the U-boat blockades, and near collapse. Victory came, but Britain paid dearly. After 1945, the tide of history could no longer be stopped. Independence movements accelerated across Asia and Africa. In 1947, British India fractured into India and Pakistan under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The partition unleashed unimaginable violence, with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands killed. Across the continent, colonies claimed freedom one by one. The Suez Crisis of 1956 shattered any illusion of British autonomy. London could no longer act without Washington's approval. By the 1960s, the once mighty empire had largely vanished.